Council since 1994, and Germany is hoping to work closely with Pretoria to resolve conflicts on the African continent. This, of course, while the G7 summit is set to get underway in Quebec in Canada this week. We now cross to our correspondent in New York, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Good evening to you, Sherwin. Firstly, before we even talk about at least the seat of the UN, I mean, as the G7 leaders gear up for this meeting, there is framing around this summit as 6 plus Trump.
Absolutely. Well, to quote the Japanese finance minister, because there was a prelude to the leaders summit later this week, Bongani, of finance ministers meeting, G7 finance ministers meeting in Canada. And this is what Japanese finance minister Taro Aso said, quote, "This doesn't happen often at the G7 meetings, but it was the United States against everyone else." And I think we've seen that, whether we're talking now about tariffs being imposed on close allies, including China, the European Union and Canada. Mexico, for example, has also been included in these this tariffs penalty introduced by the United States. Whether you're talking about the U.S. withdrawal from the JCPOA as it relates to the Iran nuclear deal, whether you're talking about the withdrawal from the Paris Climate Change Agreement, or whether you're talking about the move of the embassy to Jerusalem, the United States is very much focused on Donald Trump's America First policy. And it's going to be very interesting to see how this new approach from the United States really affects relationships moving forward. Remember, there are many other geopolitical concerns, particularly in the immediate term on the DPRK and a proposed summit on June 12th, which is Tuesday next week. So we imagine that North Korea is somehow also going to overshadow some of the discussions that are going to be happening at the G7 come Friday and Saturday this week.
All those issues that you raise, as well as we saw, of course, in the package that we played a little earlier, what does this say about global multilateralism? Is the international system as we have known it under threat in this Trump era?
Well, it depends, I think, what happens in elections in November. There are midterm elections in November this year. And, of course, the United States president is re-elected every 4 years. So I think I wouldn't say that collectively there's agreement that the multilateral system is falling apart. I think the multilateral system is still there. I think a majority of countries view institutions like the World Trade Organization, particularly as it relates to tariffs, or certainly the political or geopolitical concerns around the world. I think you have a majority of countries around the world that still see the UN Security Council and the United Nations and various other multilateral organizations as playing a central role to fixing some of the ills that face the world today. If you look at the Paris Climate Change Agreement, that was an example, a victory for multilateralism working. I think what you have now is a spanner in the works, and I think you're going to see the United States, although it still remains the largest economy in the world and plays a very crucial part in terms of what happens around the globe. I think you're going to see them increasingly isolated. You're hearing very tough talk now from the Canadians. They called this a deplorable move. You hear similar language from the Europeans. But at the end of the day, it's what happens behind closed doors that really matters. A lot of this, many people argue, is meant for Donald Trump's base in the United States. And this is an election year. So you're going to see more of this. It just depends on what, how patient countries are going to be in terms of what they want to see happening around the world.
Well, let's talk now about what's happening at the United Nations. When will we find out where the position for South Africa is going to be around this seat at the UN Security Council?
Well, let me just call it, Bongani. South Africa is going to be elected to a non-permanent seat on the Security Council. I don't think that's ever been in question. They are running on a clean slate. They've got the endorsement of the African Union. The only concern for South Africa is perhaps from a sort of an egotistical point of view. Are they going to beat the numbers that won them election in 2007? I think the number was 186 out of 192 countries. You then had the addition of South Sudan as a member state, so now it's 193 countries. In 2010, I think it was, South Africa got 182, so we saw them decline in terms of the numbers. What South Africa's ambassador, Jerry Machila, has been very clear about is that they want to beat this 186 number. But to win election to the Security Council, you require 2/3 majority in the General Assembly, so that's around about 129 votes. And at our last check, South Africa had about 160 yes votes in their corner. So it's not a question about whether South Africa will or will not. They will be elected, and that election happens on Friday. I'm told also that the Minister of International Relations, Lindiwe Sisulu, will be arriving here on Thursday. So really just adding her weight here at the last moment, really, in terms of lobbying to ensure that South Africa reaches an acceptable number, certainly in terms of support from the general membership of the UN.
Of course, she's been part of a drive to change at least the image of our policy, of our foreign policy in particular. And what will this step then mean for South Africa, particularly under this new administration under President Cyril Ramaphosa?
Well, we've spoken to some analysts particularly about what they expect from South Africa, and what they're telling us, Bongani, is that they want to see a return to South Africa placing human rights at the center of its foreign policy. Of course, South African officials will argue that that has always been the case, but we can point to certain instances, particularly as it relates to Myanmar in their first term, Zimbabwe in their first term. Remember, that was under the Mbeki presidency. Dumisani Kamala was the ambassador then. And then also concerns about South Africa. There was a concern about how South Africa voted at the Human Rights Council and the impression that this was leaving. South Africa's proposed withdrawal from the International Criminal Court. There is a concern that South Africa is had been over the years, moving away from its human rights roots, and what they want to see now under Cyril Ramaphosa's leadership is South Africa really taking a firm move and really putting its stamp on human rights issues, particularly as they pertain to the maintenance of international peace and security. As the argument goes, Bongani, is that when human rights are eroded, that is the first indication of when something can lead to a threat to international peace and security. So it's really about the balance between addressing human rights concerns, but that also fits into the mandate, which is international peace and security. And we've always seen this disconnect between what the role of the Human Rights Council is in Geneva and what the role of the UN Security Council is here in New York. And it's almost finding a middle ground between those two mandates that is going to see countries succeed, particularly in the highest-making decision body of the United Nations.
Of course, you mentioned a little earlier some of the questions that have been top of mind around international security, particularly the Israeli-Palestinian question and the remaining, I suppose, age-old positions as far as that conflict is concerned. Are we at a stalemate as far as that from a UN point of view? What happens next?
I think it's fair to say that we are at a stalemate. You know, the last indication of that was the vote on Friday, the Kuwaiti proposal that would have tasked the Secretary General of the United Nations with coming up with proposals for a protection force for Palestinian civilians who live in the occupied territories. And of course, if you remember from Friday's vote, that didn't pass due to a United States veto. There was then, Bongani, a subsequent vote from the draft proposal from the United States that would have focused essentially on the role that Hamas is playing, what they call a destabilizing role that Hamas is playing in Gaza. And the United States was the only country that voted in favor of that resolution. Essentially, it was one vote in favor, 3 votes against, and 11 abstentions. So when you talk about the levels of isolation, and this really also, I think, points to the undemocratic nature of the UN Security Council. I mean, this is an argument South Africans have been making for a very long time, is that one country can essentially block the consensus. So when the US vetoed, you had 10 countries voting in favor, 2 abstentions or 3 abstentions and 1 veto, and the veto wins the day. So this is a question about reform. And as you know, the intergovernmental process on reforming the United Nations, which includes the Security Council, has been going on for 2 decades, and we are no closer to that process being resolved.
Right, we'll have to leave it there with our UN correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease in New York. So multilateralism not necessarily dying, but certainly facing some old challenges and some new ones. We'll watch that vote as it unfolds later on this week. Stay with us. We've got more interesting and, of course, fascinating discussions for you after this quick break. You're watching The Full View.